In this video, I want to talk about what progressive Christianity is in response to the ongoing misinformation and fear-mongering that is being spread by evangelical leaders like Alyssa Childers, Mike Winger, and Sean McDowell. So consider, for example, this comment posted on one of my videos recently by a person named Martino. Progressive Christianity is the leftover when revelation is dissolved in the acid of humanist philosophy and hedonistic individualism. In this pursuit, progressive Christians are relying heavily on the classic liberal theology with its redefinition of biblical terms and historic doctrines. Sounds very ominous. In fact, I suspect that what Martino is doing here is simply regurgitating talking points that Martino has learned from people like Childers and Sean McDowell. Progressive Christianity actually is nothing as scary as all that. That is, in fact, I think really nonsense, what Martino says there. What progressive Christianity is first of all, by and large, these are Christians who have come out of conservative evangelicalism and fundamentalism in a North American context in the last 20 years or so, last 15 years, and they've begun to realize that there were key inadequacies in the theology, the conservative evangelicalism and fundamentalism in which they were raised. For example, they've recognized there were serious problems with the understanding of how science relates to faith. The coming realization that you don't need to reject Darwinian evolution in order to accept the Christian doctrine of creation, or they've rethought understandings of how faith relates to the Christian life. So, for example, doubts aren't necessarily a sign of a lack of faith or a warning sign in the Christian life, but in fact, doubt can be a healthy part of the Christian life as you work out your faith in fear and trembling in community. They've come to question understandings of the Bible that they had received. For example, that you ought to interpret the Bible literally where possible, or that the Bible is a handbook for all of life, or that it is the source of all truth. These sort of very lofty, high, pietistic sounding declarations of the Bible, which are really misbegotten pieties that misunderstand the point and the function of the Bible within the church and the Christian life. They've come to question other aspects, such as various understandings of salvation. The doctrine of penal substitution, is that the best, or the theory of penal substitution, is that the best way to understand the atonement? Can we say that every person who has never prayed a sinner's prayer goes to hell? A realization that in fact Christians have always disagreed about these topics. They've always had different theories of atonement, always had different views about what one must do in order to be saved, or how Christ's grace can meet a specific individual in space-time. Questioning something like the understanding of posthumous judgment or judgment in the afterlife. Must a person believe that those who die outside Christ are resurrected to a hell of torment that never ends, eternal conscious torment? Well, in fact, the progressive maybe comes to realize that there have always been other views of posthumous judgment in the Christian tradition. And then probably the one that most upsets conservatives is when progressive Christians begin to question some of the received perspectives within the conservative and the wider Christian community on contorted, disputed ethical conversations or topics like lesbian and gay relationships, and whether one could be gay affirming and Christian, or how to think about transgender people and a therapeutic response to gender dysphoria, and issues like that. All right, now the thing to appreciate is that within this whole conversation, there's no one set of beliefs that defines a progressive Christian as such. There's no progressive Christian creed that says, well, you check these boxes. You have to vote for Democrats if you're an American. You have to be pro-choice. You have to reject the inerrancy of the Bible, and you have to accept gay marriage or something like that, and then you're a progressive Christian. That's not how it works. Progressive Christianity is just a loose term. It's a loose affiliation of people who in various ways are questioning their conservative Christian and fundamentalist upbringing. Much of this can be understood 15 years ago within the broader rubric of Christians who call themselves emergent and emerging. And again, we're coming out of the evangelical tradition and coming to question it. Earlier than that, people talked with Brian McLaren's language of a new kind of Christian, or they talked in the late 90s about post-evangelicals. Before then, back to the 1980s, in fact, there was a conversation between people like Bernard Ramm and the neo-Orthodox Christians, and exploring, Bernard Ramm wrote a well-known book called After Fundamentalism, exploring some of the same issues, but in the early 1980s. So this is actually not a new thing. And in fact, you could even say Carl Henry back to the 1940s, when he wrote his book, The Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism, he too was essentially the emerging progressive Christian of his day, questioning and challenging the conservative fundamentalism of the 1920s and 30s. What Carl Henry was doing in the 1940s, what Bernard Ramm was doing in the 1980s, what people like Stan Grenz and Brian McLaren were doing in the late 90s and early 2000s, that's just what progressive Christians are doing today. It's nothing to be afraid of. In fact, what it is simply people working out their faith in fear and trembling in community, trying to figure out what it means to be a Christian in their day and age. Now, in every day and age, there have been people from the other side. If you want to think in terms of simple sides, in fact, it's much more complicated than that. But there have always been people from the other side who have wanted to question reform movements, wanted to question people who think and challenge and want to grow in their faith. And they name call, and they try to raise fear and censure by throwing up these various terms, such as, well, you're the ashes of humanist philosophy, or whatever, or you come from liberal theology. No, it's simply people working out their faith. Now, do all progressive Christians get it right? No, they don't. Do all evangelical Christians get it right? No, they don't. Are all progressive Christians Orthodox? No, they're not. Are all evangelical Christians Orthodox? No, they're not. Do you know that Kenneth Copeland is considered an evangelical, and the whole Word of Faith movement is broadly considered within the evangelical umbrella? And yet I think it's fair to say that by and large, the Word of Faith movement is a heretical and an unchristian movement, one counter to the gospel, and yet it's considered part of broad evangelical Christianity. Oneness Pentecostals are generally considered to be part of evangelical Christianity, and yet Oneness Pentecostals reject the doctrine of the Trinity. They affirm a modalist conception of the Trinity. I think another thing that historic Christians understand to be heretical. So yeah, you can point to various individual progressives and maybe institutions or churches that you might understand to be progressive, which could be to various degrees unorthodox, even heretical. But that's the exact same thing you can find in evangelical Christianity. And so my proposal for everybody is, let's drop the fear mongering. Let's drop the rhetoric that talks about, building a theology out of the acids of humanism or humanist philosophy or whatever. Let's get rid of that nonsense. Let's recognize that what progressive Christianity is simply what Christians have always done and what continue to do, which is to try to figure out their faith. Sometimes they get it right, sometimes they get it wrong. Rather than name call them and label them and give erroneous views of them, fear-mongering them, spreading misinformation about them, why don't you order a couple coffees at your local coffee shop and sit down with them and have a theological conversation?